All right, friends, this is the critical attributes, and you should know most of this. Hang on just a moment. Okay, so how are you going to take notes? If you just want to kind of sketch this, or maybe halfway into it decide to take notes, you might know most of this stuff already. So we are going to talk about some critical attributes. That's a review, and that is going to be domain, range, and if it is a function. If you notice here, I have my handy dandy pencil, and I am scanning this graph for a lot of reasons. I can scan this graph, first of all, to determine if it's a function. I can scan this graph to see if it has domain, and I can scan this graph to see if it has a range. So let's talk about, is this guy going to be a function or not? And remember, I'm using functional notation here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scan the graph from left to right. And I know that that is a function because when I scanned that with my pencil, I only touched the graph function one time. There were no repeating y values. So is this a function? Absolutely. All right, so let's go ahead and review quickly what domain and range is. We're still going to be reading the graph from left to right, but for now, let me get rid of that, delete. But for now, let me put my pencil back. So from left to right and from the bottom up, those are our two key terms for domain and range. For the domain, we're going to scan the graph from left to right. Let me do that again. So as I scan, I'm scanning, boom. Right there is the first thing that I land on. That is going to be a -4, and that -4 has a closed dot. So your domain is going to start at the -4. And notice that I do have a bracket because it's part equal. So going back to my pencil, I'm scanning, boom. There's where the graph stops. The graph stops where x equals 5. And that is going to be a bracket because it's a closed dot. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about let's go ahead and talk about range. For the range, it is bottoms up. So I'm moving my pencil sideways, and I'm going to start at the bottom of the graph. My pencil isn't perfectly sideways, but that's okay. All right, scanning from the bottom up, boom. Right there is the first place that I touch the graph. What is that y value? Whatever that y value is, that's where your range starts. That y value is a -3, and it's a closed circle. So that's what our range is going to look like. Now, to finish the range, we're just going to keep scanning up. Scanning up. That is where the graph ends. What is that y value? That is going to be a +6. And I know that it has a bracket. If you have parentheses, you will know when to use parentheses because you will have an open circle. All right, let's talk a moment about discrete and continuous. If I lift my pencil to hop over to a different piece of the graph, that's discrete. If I never have to lift my pencil like we saw on this first graph right here, if I wanted to trace this graph, I never had to lift my pencil. I never had to move it. So I know that this graph is continuous. I also know it's continuous because I was able to write domain and range in a single interval notation. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this piece right here. So for this piece, we are going to go ahead and slide our pencil. And what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to determine if it's a function. If I am on any point more than once, it's not a function. Vertical line test, one time. So we know that this is certainly a function. Is it a function? Yep, sure is. Let's talk about domain and range. So this graph is discrete because I had to lift my pencil to go back to the other points on the graph. If it is discrete, there is no such thing as interval notation. Don't even look at that. Interval notation. That does not exist for discrete graphs. You're going to have to do set notation. In other words, just list out all the x and y values. So I'm going to go ahead and start my brace. And I am going to grab my pencil because I am going to scan from left to right. Scanning, 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 boom. That first spot is going to be a -3 for the, I just don't know why it keeps popping up, domain. All right, the next place that I see is going to be -2. And then we're going to go to +1, +2, and then a +5. And what I just listed were the remaining x values. So again, that was +1, +2, and +5. All right, range. So for the range, here we go. You got to change the pencil sideways, and it's always bottoms up for range. Let me get this out of the way here. Okay, so bottoms up. I land on that first dot at the bottom of the graph, so my very first range value is going to be a -5. -5, and then let's see what happens here as we continue. -5, that's 0 for the range. +1. Now remember, even though I touch those both at the same time, that's okay because those are y values. Remember, it's the x values that cannot repeat. And then we're going to wrap up our range with a +4. So for this graph, again, it is going to be -5, 0. Only list that one value one time. Even though it repeats, it's just a single value. And then we're going to wrap it up with a +4. And that is going to be domain and range for that discrete graph. Okay, very quickly, I can tell that this is certainly going to be a function because my pencil passes it only one time. So is this going to be a function? Absolutely. Domain, range. Also, this function is continuous, so I'm going to have interval notation. For the domain, the graph starts right here at the -6. It goes on and on and on, and then it stops at +6. So my range is my domain is -6 to +6. And I hope that you're like, wait a second, that's not right, because it's not right. I have to go back and grab my eraser because I put parentheses. And remember, it should be brackets because it is very clear that there are closed circles there. So let me fix my work and make those brackets. All right, so for the domain, for the range, bottom up, scanning, scanning, scanning. The first thing we land on for the range is a -3. And the last thing we land on is a 7. So for the range, it is going to be -3 to +7. And they get brackets too. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this one. If you notice, I have an open circle here, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be having a parenthesis in my interval notation. Let me go ahead and grab this pencil. So first of all, is it going to be a function? Scanning, I'm only touching one point. Oh, I have to hop over to this side, but this is continuous here. So is the graph continuous? Not really. However, I am still going to use interval notation, and I'll show you why. All right, let me go back and grab the domain. The domain starts at -5. There's a hop in the graph right here. So the domain's -5 to a +1, and then we're going to grab it again on that green line segment from a 2 all the way over to a 5. So here's what your domain is going to look like. the domain is going to be -5 all the way to a +1. Or we're going to, ooh, I did it again. That needs to be erased because I finally have an open dot in one of my examples. So let me grab my eraser. Let me erase that because that certainly needs to be a, there we go, a parenthesis. Erase, erase, erase. Okay, guys. Parenthesis. We're going to pick it up right there at that 2. And then it is going to get closed at the 5. And the 5 certainly gets a bracket because that's a closed dot. All right, so let's talk about range. Moving my pencil sideways. Let me get him out of the way. I don't need that extra annotation. All right, bottoms up. Here we go. Scanning, 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 boom. The first Y value I land on is a -2. So I'm going to write range. Starts with a -2, and it is a closed circle. And then we're going to scan up, scan up, scan up, scan up. Okay, now, even though we had a break in the domain, we do not have a break in the range value. So even though you do have a break right there on that green, if you look to the left of my pencil, the blue portion of that graph is still touching it. So I am not going to have to write any separate piece for my range value. It's going to be one component of interval notation. So I'm going to scroll up. It almost looks like I want to stop there, but the graph keeps going. The graph is going to go all the way up to 4. And that's how I'm going to wrap up my interval notation for range. And it is going to be a bracket because there is not any indication of an open circle. Okay, so I'm already around 12 minutes and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but will you please see if you can write this in interval notation for domain and range? Because this is your level, guys. Go ahead and see what you can do with that. So real quick, I just want to point out, again, this is discrete. This is completely discrete. There's dots all over the place. No interval notation whatsoever. We'd have to list all of these out in order from least to greatest. But I just wanted to point out right here that this is not a function because you have repeating x values at the 4. Let's see. Okay, so we have 13 minutes for this video. Will you please practice domain and range and if it's a function until sync starts?